August 2nd, 1975. Memorial Stadium, Berkeley, California, 3:47 p.m. 20,000 people sat on the grass in the summer heat, waiting for Bob Dylan to finish his set. The smell of marijuana mixed with hot dogs and sweat. The sun was starting its slow descent toward the bay, painting everything golden. In the front section, 20 feet from the stage, sat a man in a wheelchair. His name was James "Jimmy" Daniels. He was 26 years old, but his eyes were 50. He wore a faded green Army jacket with a 101st Airborne patch on the shoulder. Dog tags hung around his neck, catching the sunlight. His left pant leg was folded and pinned at the knee. The leg was gone. Vietnam had taken it. Dylan was mid-song, his wild afro silhouetted against the California sky, his acoustic guitar cutting through the afternoon air. He'd been performing for 40 minutes, and the crowd was in that perfect state of concert euphoria, singing along, swaying, lost in the music. But then Dylan looked down. He saw the wheelchair. He saw the uniform. He saw the folded pant leg. He saw a young man who'd given everything to a war that nobody wanted, sitting alone in a crowd of 20,000. And Dylan stopped singing. The band played on for 3 more bars before they realized something was wrong. The music died. 20,000 people fell silent. And what happened next would prove that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop everything and see the person everyone else is ignoring. Jimmy Daniels had enlisted in the Army on his 18th birthday. Not because he wanted to fight, not because he believed in the war, but because his father had fought in World War II and his grandfather in World War I, and the Daniels men served. It was that simple. He'd landed in Vietnam in December 1968, assigned to the 101st Airborne Division. For 7 months, he'd walked through jungles that tried to kill him every minute of every day. Snakes, disease, booby traps, Viet Cong snipers. He'd watched friends die. He'd killed men whose faces he still saw when he closed his eyes. On July 3rd, 1969, his platoon was clearing a village when he stepped on a mine. The explosion took his left leg below the knee, shattered his right ankle, and left shrapnel embedded in his spine that doctors said was too dangerous to remove. He woke up in a field hospital 3 days later, screaming for morphine. They shipped him home in September 1969. No parade, no welcome, just a wheelchair and a one-way ticket to Oakland. When he rolled through the airport in his uniform, people spit on him, called him baby killer, threw things. One woman screamed in his face that he deserved what he got. He was 19 years old. For 6 years, Jimmy had lived in a VA hospital, then a tiny apartment in Richmond that his disability check barely covered. He had nightmares every night. He couldn't work, couldn't walk, couldn't escape the war that was over everywhere except in his head. Music was the only thing that helped, specifically Bob Dylan, because Dylan's songs were about truth, even when the truth was ugly, about speaking for people who had no voice, about being an outsider in a country that didn't understand you. When Jimmy heard Dylan was playing Berkeley, he'd spent 3 weeks' worth of food money on a ticket. He'd taken 2 buses and wheeled himself a mile through Berkeley streets to get there, because for 3 hours he could forget. For 3 hours, the music could drown out the screaming in his head. Dylan stood at the edge of the stage, guitar hanging from his shoulder, staring at Jimmy. The silence stretched. People in the crowd started whispering. Security guards looked at each other, confused. Jimmy felt 20,000 eyes turned toward him. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to roll away. But he couldn't move. He was frozen, locked in Dylan's gaze. Dylan handed his guitar to a roadie and knelt at the edge of the stage. He was maybe 15 feet above the crowd, but he leaned down as far as he could, trying to get closer. "What's your name?" Dylan's voice carried across the stadium, amplified by the microphone he still held. Jimmy couldn't speak. His throat had closed. "Come on, man, tell me your name." "Jimmy," the word came out as a whisper. "Jimmy Daniels." "Where'd you serve, Jimmy?" The crowd went dead silent. This wasn't a concert anymore. This was something else. "Vietnam, 101st Airborne, 68 to 69. Dylan nodded slowly. "How old are you?" 26. 26. Dylan repeated it like he was trying to make sense of it. A 26-year-old man in a wheelchair with an empty pant leg and eyes that had seen hell. "You came here alone?" Jimmy nodded. "Why?" The question hung in the air. Why would a Vietnam veteran come to a Bob Dylan concert? Dylan, who'd written anti-war songs. Dylan, whose fans had probably spit on soldiers coming home. Dylan, who represented everything the military establishment hated. Jimmy's voice broke. Because your music makes me feel less alone. Dylan stood up. He looked at his band, at his crew, at the 20,000 people waiting to see what he'd do. Then he made a decision that went against every rule of concert performance. Everybody sit down, Dylan said into the microphone. Right now, sit down. The crowd, confused but obedient, sat. 20,000 people lowering themselves to the grass, creating a sea of seated bodies. I want you to look at this man, Dylan pointed at Jimmy. His name is Jimmy Daniels. He's 26 years old. He gave his leg to this country in a war most of you protested. He came home to people spitting on him. And he came here today alone because music was the only thing he had left. The stadium was so quiet you could hear the wind. Now, I've spent 10 years singing about war, about how it's wrong, about how we need to stop sending our kids to die. And I still believe that. But you know what? This man right here didn't start that war. He was 18 years old when they sent him. 18. Same age as half of you. Dylan's voice was shaking now. So here's what we're going to do. Every single person in this stadium is going to stand up, and you're going to give this man the welcome home he deserved 6 years ago. You're going to show him that we might hate the war, but we don't hate him. Someone in the crowd yelled, "Welcome home, Jimmy!" Then another voice, then 10, then 100, and then 20,000 people rose to their feet and began to cheer. Not polite applause. Roaring, screaming, crying welcome. People were chanting his name. Jimmy! 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 Jimmy Daniels collapsed. His body shook with sobs so violent the wheelchair trembled. He covered his face with his hands, but he couldn't stop the tears. 6 years of pain, 6 years of shame, 6 years of being invisible came pouring out of him. People around him were crying too. A woman in a tie-dye shirt knelt beside his wheelchair and held his hand. A man with a peace sign on his jacket put his hand on Jimmy's shoulder. The very people who'd protested the war were surrounding this soldier, touching him, crying with him, telling him they were sorry. Dylan climbed down from the stage. Security tried to stop him, but he pushed past them and walked directly to Jimmy's wheelchair. He knelt in front of the veteran. "Jimmy, look at me." Jimmy couldn't. He was still sobbing, still shaking. "Jimmy?" Dylan's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me, brother." Jimmy finally raised his head. His face was wet, his eyes red. "You are not alone," Dylan said. "You hear me? You are not alone, and you are not invisible. We see you. Every person here sees you." Jimmy tried to speak but couldn't form words. Dylan looked up at the crowd. "Who else here served in Vietnam?" A few hands went up, then more, then dozens. Men in the crowd, most of them trying to hide, most of them ashamed, raising their hands. "Stand up," Dylan said. "All of you, stand up." They stood. Maybe 50 men scattered through the crowd, standing while everyone else sat. "Look around, Jimmy. You're not the only one. And none of you are alone anymore." The crowd exploded in applause again, this time for all the veterans. People were hugging the men who stood, thanking them, welcoming them home. Dylan stood up and addressed the crowd. "We're going to do something different now. I'm going to play a song I've never performed live before. It's called Forever Young, and I'm playing it for Jimmy and every man like him who gave something they can never get back." He climbed back on stage, picked up his acoustic guitar, and began to play. But his voice was different now, softer, more vulnerable, like he was singing to one person instead of 20,000. "May God bless and keep you always. May your wishes all come true." In the front section, Jimmy sat in his wheelchair, surrounded by strangers who'd become friends, listening to Bob Dylan sing him a blessing. The crowd didn't sing along. They just listened. Some swayed gently. Most cried. This wasn't a concert anymore. This was a healing service. When the song ended, Dylan set down his guitar. "I'm going to take a break, but before I do, I want every person in this stadium to do something for me. If you see someone who served, thank them. If you see someone who's struggling, help them. And if you see someone who's invisible, see them. That's how we fix this country. Not with war, not with protest, but with seeing each other. He walked off stage. The band followed. The crowd sat in stunned silence. And in that silence, something beautiful happened. People began moving toward the veterans who'd stood up, shaking their hands, hugging them, crying with them. The generation that had protested the war was reconciling with the men who'd fought it. After the concert, Dylan's security brought Jimmy backstage. He wheeled through corridors that smelled like beer and cigarettes, past roadies packing equipment, until he reached Dylan's dressing room. Dylan was sitting on a couch smoking, still wearing his denim jacket. When Jimmy rolled in, Dylan stood. "How you doing, man?" "I don't know," Jimmy said honestly. "I've never felt anything like that." Dylan sat back down and gestured for Jimmy to come closer. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "What's the hardest part? Not the leg. I mean the part nobody sees." Jimmy looked down at his hands. "Knowing that I did something terrible, and I can't undo it. Knowing that people died because of me, and knowing that the country I did it for hates me for it." "The country doesn't hate you. The war, yeah, but not you." "Feels the same," Dylan nodded. "I get that, but what you felt out there today, that was real. Those people don't hate you. They just didn't know how to separate you from the war. Nobody taught them how. What you did out there," Jimmy's voice broke again. "Nobody's ever done that for me. Nobody's ever made me feel like I mattered. You do matter. Your pain matters. Your sacrifice matters. Even if the war was wrong, what you gave was real." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Dylan stood and walked to a corner of the room. He picked up his guitar, the one he'd been playing on the stage, and brought it to Jimmy. "I want you to have this." Jimmy stared. "I can't take your guitar." "Why not?" It's yours. It's an instrument, a tool, and right now you need it more than I do." Dylan pressed it into Jimmy's hands. "Learn to play, write your own songs, tell your own story, because people need to hear it." Jimmy Daniels took Dylan's guitar home that night. For 3 months, he didn't touch it. It sat in the corner of his apartment, a beautiful thing he didn't deserve. But eventually he picked it up. His fingers were clumsy. The chords were wrong. But he kept trying. By 1976, he was playing in VA hospitals for other veterans, men like him who'd come home broken. By 1977, he'd started a support group for Vietnam vets. They met in a church basement in Oakland. 12 men at first, then 50, then hundreds. By 1980, he'd helped found the Vietnam Veterans of America, an organization that would go on to help millions of soldiers get the mental health care and recognition they deserved. And every meeting, every event, every gathering began the same way. Jimmy would hold up Dylan's guitar and tell the story of August 2nd, 1975, the day Bob Dylan stopped a concert and saw him. "This guitar," he'd say, "represents what happens when someone sees you, really sees you, not as a symbol, not as a mistake, but as a human being who matters." Over the next 40 years, Jimmy Daniels helped tens of thousands of veterans. He lobbied Congress. He built treatment centers. He fought for disability rights. He became a voice for the voiceless. And it all traced back to one afternoon when a musician stopped singing and started seeing. Dylan never talked about that day publicly. When reporters asked why he'd stopped the concert, he'd shrug. "Man needed to be seen. So I saw him." But people close to Dylan knew it had affected him deeply. He'd grown up believing in protest, in anti-war activism, in speaking truth to power. But that day he'd learned something that complicated his worldview. The soldiers weren't the enemy. The boys who'd been sent to fight were victims too. And in his righteous anger about the war, he'd missed seeing their pain. After that concert, Dylan started adding a verse to his performances of "Blowin' in the Wind," a verse about young men sent to die, about how the answer wasn't just stopping war, but healing the warriors who'd survived it. He donated money to Vietnam veteran organizations, anonymously, consistently, for decades. And whenever he saw someone in uniform at his concerts, he'd nod. A small gesture, but veterans noticed. They knew they were welcome. Jimmy Daniels died in 2019. He was 70 years old. The obituary in the New York Times mentioned his advocacy, his organizations, his impact. But the last paragraph mentioned the guitar. Mr. Daniels kept Bob Dylan's guitar for his entire life, refusing offers from collectors that reached six figures. "It's not for sale," he would say. "It's a reminder that being seen can save your life." That guitar now hangs in the National Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Next to it, a plaque reads, "Given by Bob Dylan to James Daniels, August 2nd, 1975. A reminder that healing begins with recognition." The lesson of that day isn't about music or fame or grand gestures. It's about seeing the invisible people, the broken soldiers, the struggling veterans, the people society discards. Jimmy Daniels came to a concert invisible and left seen. That recognition gave him the strength to rebuild his life, to help others, to matter. Bob Dylan stopped a concert that day, but what he really stopped was one man's descent into invisibility. And in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would help millions. Because on August 2nd, 1975, Bob Dylan proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop everything. Look someone in the eye and say, "I see you. You matter. Welcome home." Welcome.